We are back, APUSH homeboys and homegirls. Today we're going to take a look at Gilded Age politics, roughly from 1868 to the 1890s. And in 1868, there's an election, and President Grant, the Civil War general, Grant wins the presidency for the Republican Party in 1868. This guy has no real political experience, but he was a hero, so he wins the presidency. And really a big part of his victory comes from the fact that there was a temporary social and political revolution going on in the South during Reconstruction when black voters were able to vote for the first time, and those black voters are voting for the Republican candidates. And the freedmen give the Republican Party a huge boost. Now the problem for Grant is there's going to be a lot of corruption during his administration. And it's really the people around him that are the kind of key culprits in this corruption. There's an event called the Credit Mobilier Affair where his vice president and members of Congress are involved in this sale of railroad stock, and it's a whole scandal there where they're personally enriching themselves. You have the whiskey ring in 1875 where Grant's private secretary is found to be stealing $3 million from the federal government in a tax corruption scheme. And there's many other examples of this corruption. In fact, the term Grantism is a term that was used to describe corruption in politics. So Grant's going to have a hard time as president. Now, the ultimate symbol of Gilded Age political corruption can be seen in Boss Tweed. And this is local political corruption because in a place in New York City, there was a political machine run by the Democratic Party called Tammany Hall. And the boss of that political party was that guy right there, Boss Tweed. And he's going to use bribery, graft, and fraud to steal over $200 million from New York taxpayers. And really he is, and Tammany Hall itself is the symbol of this corruption. And unfortunately for Boss Tweed, Thomas Nast, a political cartoonist, will ultimately expose this corruption to the masses, as you see on that political cartoon right there. Now, something bad happens in 1873. There's a panic. And the Panic of 1873 really kind of hurts the entire economy because it's a severe economic collapse that further distracts the nation from enforcing Reconstruction. And so there's this huge panic, banks are failing, huge amount of unemployment, business is failing as well, and there's some causes here that are revealing that the economy is not healthy. One is overproduction in industries such as factories, railroad, and mining, and over-speculation by bankers. They were giving out too much money that couldn't be paid back. And this panic lasts for a number of years, and the hard times are going to be inflicted worst on the debtors and farmers and people in those categories. And this brings up a debate over monetary policies. Debtors advocate for relaxation of tight money policies where there is a restriction to the access to easy money. And the debate comes down to those who favor hard currency, gold and silver, versus paper money or soft currency such as greenbacks. And ultimately, it is going to be a debate that's going to reemerge, especially in the 1890s, when farmers, the agrarian sector, and other debtor groups want cheap money. They want greenbacks issued. They want to make it rain. Well, after 2 terms as president, there's another election, and this is the election of 1876. Grant's gone. The Republicans turn to Rutherford B. Hayes, and he's running against the Democrat Samuel Tilden. And this election's a very important election because there is a political controversy. 3 of the states, the returns are contested, and they all happen to be in southern states. And there's a big, controversy as to whether or not it's going to be the Republican guy, Hayes, or the Democrat, Tilden, to take the White House. And ultimately, a compromise is reached called the Compromise of 1877. And in this compromise, a couple of things happen. One, the South and Democrats will recognize the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes. He will become the President of the United States. In exchange for them recognizing Hayes' presidency, he would agree to pull out the last federal troops from the South and formally end Reconstruction. It was already kind of slowing down. There were only federal troops in about 2 to 3 southern states, but he's going to pull them out and formally end the Reconstruction process. And then finally, Hayes, the Republicans need to provide the South with political positions, patronage, and federal aid for the building of a transcontinental railroad for the South through Texas. And important to keep in mind is this compromise of 1877 is the formal end of Reconstruction. And as the federal troops are withdrawn, those troops which were protecting African Americans and the Republican governments, they are withdrawn and Reconstruction is abandoned. Now, it's not just the federal troops leaving which ends Reconstruction. The courts also undermined it. Little review here. Remember the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This protected rights. And in this act of 1875, it made it a crime for any individual to deny full and equal use of public places. It also prohibited racial discrimination in jury selection. So this Civil Rights Act of 1875 was designed to protect the rights of African Americans. And in the civil rights cases of 1883, the courts strike that law down. In these cases, the Supreme Court says the 14th Amendment only protected against government violations of civil rights. Translation, individuals can discriminate all they want. So if railroad companies or hotels or other businesses would like to discriminate, they have the right to do so. Therefore, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is overturned. And what's important to keep in mind is as Reconstruction is abandoned, Jim Crow laws are going to spread throughout the South. And the court's decisions are going to support segregation laws throughout the South. And very important, you know, is Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And in this case, the Supreme Court rules racial segregation was constitutional if equal facilities were made available to each race. And this establishes the separate but equal doctrine. And we all hopefully know it was always separate but never equal. And so you get Jim Crow laws spreading segregation throughout the South, and it is validated and approved by the courts. And another thing you should keep in mind is this idea of the New South in the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction era. This idea was promoted, especially by Southerners, a few Southerners, that the South would rebuild, it would industrialize, and they would develop their economy. But the reality is, in spite of these calls for this New South, yes, there's a rise in textile factories in the South is going to largely remain agrarian, sharecropping, and tenant farming is going to continue to be the dominant economic activity. And life for African Americans in the post-Reconstruction South is going to continue to be filled with many challenges. Let me give you a couple of examples. 15th Amendment, if you recall, gave black men the right to vote, not women, and this was a big controversy, and slowly you see the systematic disenfranchisement of Southern blacks. And this was done in a number of ways, and you could see violence and intimidation was one, but also things like literacy tests, poll taxes, property requirements were designed to disenfranchise African American voters. They also established grandfather clauses which exempted from electoral requirements anyone who had voted in the election of 1860 or prior, which meant white people did not have to fulfill these electoral requirements. And what you see, if you recall that temporary social and political revolution where Republicans and black voters were winning southern states, that's going to quickly fall apart after Reconstruction ends. And Democrats are going to dominate the South. White Democratic governments, the so-called Redeemers, are reassuming political power throughout the South. One other thing that's happening during this time period, kind of outside of Reconstruction, is a huge increase, a large increase in Asian immigration, especially from China. And Chinese immigrants, especially Chinese men, are going to play a huge role in the mining booms. You can see Chinese miners at that bottom photo, and in the building of the railroads. And after those kind of economic boom and bust cycles take place, Chinese immigrants are going to spread out throughout the West, but there's going to be a spike in nativism towards Asian immigrants, especially in the West where their populations were larger. And as a result of this, you're going to get a very important law, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited further immigration of Chinese laborers to the United States. And this is a hugely important law because it's the first time immigration restrictions were put in place on the basis of race and nationality. And what you see in the Chinese Exclusion Act is a national policy of discrimination towards Chinese immigrants because of race. Real quickly, we're going to take a look at the Gilded Age presidents. And you don't need to memorize these guys. In fact, very often they're kind of jokingly referred to as the forgotten presidents. They are the ones with the worst names ever. Rutherford, Garfield, Chester, Grover, and so on. But you could see, you have Republicans, you have Democrats serving in office. And the Gilded Age, it's important you keep in mind, it's this post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction era of rapid economic and population growth. And that term, Gilded Age, was coined by Mark Twain, and he used it as a sarcastic term to criticize this era. And in this lecture, we're only going to take a look at the political kind of aspects of the Gilded Age. And one of the key things you need to keep in mind, directly from the APUSH curriculum, is Gilded Age politics were intimately tied to big business and focused nationally on economic issues such as tariffs and currency policy. Real sexy and exciting stuff, I know. Both political parties during the Gilded Age are going to ignore the political and social consequences of industrialization. So the rise of poverty and bad working conditions are going to be ignored by the Republicans and Democrats because there's going to be a belief in this idea of laissez-faire, to leave things alone. The government should not regulate or monitor society. And it's important you keep in mind, no matter which president we're looking at, they are largely going to pursue a pro-business policy. And we've already seen one example with the currency issue favoring the kind of hard money, gold or silver. But one other issue that we're going to look at that becomes an issue in national politics is civil service reform and tariffs. Patronage was used by both political parties, and that all goes down to this idea that civil service jobs were given to supporters. To the victor belongs the spoils. We saw the spoil system, talked about during the Jackson lecture, and there was growing criticism and calls for reform of the civil service. There was this perception that these people were very often corrupt and did not know what they were doing. And the only reason they got the job was because of loyalty. And so there were calls for people to reform that. Another thing that you need to kind of keep in mind is that you have two camps within the political parties. One, half-breeds advocated civil service reform, and their leader is James Blaine, and the other group was the stalwarts, and these were supporters of patronage, and they're best represented by Roscoe Conkling. Tariffs was also an issue that you need to keep in mind for Gilded Age politics, and a big thing that was happening is by the 1880s, the U.S. Treasury had a huge surplus from tariffs. There was a lot of money, and people, you see Grover Cleveland, the Democrats, and farmers and others wanted to cut those tariffs down and lower those tariffs, and that's going to be a big issue during this period. A couple key things to keep in mind. Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, he's the guy who gets elected in the disputed election, and the Compromise of 1877 settles that. He does send federal troops to break up the Great Railroad Strike, sending in the federal troops to break up a labor union, and we'll learn a little bit more about that in another video. James Garfield, he's elected. He's also a Republican. He's assassinated. And his VP, Chester A. Arthur, takes over, and he supports, surprisingly, since he is a stalwart, the Pendleton Act, which establishes civil service reform. And it establishes the Civil Service Commission so that people to get federal jobs had to take a competitive exam to prove that they were capable of doing the job. Grover Cleveland, the Democrats regained the White House in 1884. In the election of 1884, he is a strong advocate of laissez-faire. Most of these guys are. His famous quote, "Though the people support the government should not support the people." He does sign into law the Interstate Commerce Act, which we'll take a look at in another chapter. And then the Republicans regain the White House with Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of the former president. He advocates for keeping the tariff high. In fact, during his presidency, there's going to be this so-called billion-dollar Congress, and they, in 1890, are going to pass the McKinley Tariff, one of the highest tariffs in American history, and also increase the Civil War pensions. And then, of course, for the first and only time in American history, a president will come back into the White House to serve a non-consecutive second term. And we'll take a look at a little bit more about what happens during this time period in other videos. That's going to do it for today. I hope you found Gilded Age politics exciting. It's my least favorite topic in American history, but if you have any questions, you can always post a comment. Click like on the video if you haven't done so. Subscribe. Tell some friends to do the same. And get a 5 on that exam, people. APUSH Beast Mode. Peace.